Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today we're going to be looking at the figure of Melchizedek. The writer of Hebrews spends 3 chapters looking at Melchizedek and comparing Jesus to him. But Melchizedek has only a paragraph of description in Genesis chapter 14 and a very slight mention in Psalm 110. Why would he become such a central figure for the writer of Hebrews and other first century writers thinking about the Messiah? In this lesson, we're going to look in detail at Melchizedek, what we learn from Genesis 14 about him, how Psalm 110 expands on the picture of Melchizedek, and how other first century writers, both first century BC and AD, were thinking about Melchizedek by looking at a couple of critical Dead Sea Scrolls. Thank you for joining me today as we consider the glimpses of the supernatural in the figure of Melchizedek. Right. Today, as we continue our study of glimpses of the supernatural through the figures of Genesis, we are looking at Melchizedek. We're going to Genesis 14 as our starting point to talk about Melchizedek. I think it's no exaggeration to say that Melchizedek is part of a group of figures from Genesis that really captured the imaginations, one might say, certainly the writings of Jews in Jesus' day and in the time before that. People like Enoch, people like Abel that we looked at were much more talked about in the days of Christ as figures related to what we might call eschatology, those plans of God unfolding for his ultimate judgment on earth. And Melchizedek is in that same group. So even though there's not a lot said about him, little more than there was said about Enoch in the actual scriptures, he becomes a figure that's very prominent in the thinking of the Jews in the days of Jesus. I'm going to give you a lot of background information, both what's in the Bible and some of the things that were being written and said about him in the first century. We start with just this guy named Melchizedek who shows up in Genesis 14 out of the blue and then disappears just as suddenly. And we find that story in Genesis 14. I'm going to back up to verse 17, a little bit before Melchizedek shows up, because this story is a sandwich. We looked at the Gospel of Mark and the sandwich technique that Mark uses. He'll start a story, and then before ending it, he goes off in a completely different story, and then comes back and finishes it. The one that comes to mind readily from Mark is when Jesus is sending off the 70 to go into the villages. They leave, and then we get this long discussion of John the Baptist and his demise at the hands of Herod. And then after that, we get the disciples coming back to Jesus and reporting about what they did while they were out visiting the villages. And so there's a sandwich that starts and ends with the disciples going to the villages, and in the middle is John the Baptist. Well, here we get a sandwich which begins and ends with the king of Sodom coming out to talk to Abraham, and in the middle we get Melchizedek. And so I'm just going to read a little bit about the outside pieces of the sandwich and then the middle. So in Genesis 14, 17 through 21, after his return from defeating Kedorlaomer, and that's Abraham. This is an interesting passage overall because it's about Abraham being a warrior and defeating kings. And we just don't usually have a picture of Abraham as that warrior out there with a sword fighting the enemy. But this is how he's pictured in this passage, as a warrior. And he defeats this king, Kedorlaomer, and the kings who are with him. And then after Abraham defeats them, the king of Sodom went out to meet him, Abraham, at the valley of Shaveh, that is the valley of the king. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." And he gave to him a tenth of everything. And then the sandwich finishes, and the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people, but the possessions take for yourself. I don't have time to do this whole deal about how the king of Sodom and the king Melchizedek, the king of Salem, play off each other, but that is an interesting thing, that one reason for that whole sandwich method of telling a story is to compare the middle with the outsides and to think about how these things interact with each other. The whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing hasn't happened yet, but we kind of know it's going to. So when we read about the king of Sodom, we already are thinking of somebody who's not a respected figure. But then we have Melchizedek from Salem. And that's no coincidence that Jerusalem, Salem, is in that, because Jerusalem is associated with this Salem of which Melchizedek is the king. So yeah, we have a kind of good and bad thing playing off of each other with that. And whereas Melchizedek is blessing Abram, and the king of Sodom seems to be doing the same thing, wanting to give stuff to Abram. Abram receives the food, at least, from Melchizedek and then gives him a tithe, whereas he refuses to cooperate with the proposition from the king of Sodom. And he doesn't take anything from the king of Sodom when he offers it. But reason why king of Sodom may have become a person of interest for Abram was because Lot was living in Sodom at the time. So there is definitely a connection to Sodom. There's also a sense that maybe Sodom is the bigger of the two cities between Sodom and Gomorrah, because Sodom's always mentioned first, and we have a king of Sodom, and Gomorrah is just sort of always the and. This little story, and we're going to, from here, ignore the king of Sodom part and just focus on what we see about Melchizedek. But there are some features of Melchizedek which were later noted, but they're all in the story itself. And so I want to bring out some of these features that were later seen as messianic qualities, but are innate with the story of Melchizedek. So first off, we see that Melchizedek is both a king and a priest. He's said to be the king of Salem, but then he's also said to be a priest of God Most High. And where have we seen king and priest connected, even in this series? Adam. Adam was to rule over the earth. He had a rulership role, a kingly role, but he also served in the garden in the same kind of way that a priest would serve in the temple. He was a servant of the Lord's place, and he was a king over it. So king and priestly language has been there from Adam, and it is applied also to Melchizedek, and it becomes a big part of the messianic profile for what's expected of the Messiah. He will be a king and a priest. I think that this tension between king and priest is something that is bubbling underneath this narrative all along. Moses sort of lost the possibility of combining the role of priest and king. Moses is a Levite. He's also serving as the de facto king by leading the people at their head and giving them instructions. But Moses sort of loses the opportunity to be a king and a priest when he has Aaron come alongside him, and then Aaron becomes the priestly line. How Moses' sons sort of disappear because he doesn't have that role. But looking back to Melchizedek, that's one reason why Melchizedek resonates all through that, especially in the first century, is because they were wanting to bring role of king and priest together because they saw that that was kind of where God was going. He separated them into two roles, but would eventually bring them back together. And when they were brought together, it would be in the Messiah. So he's associated, Melchizedek, with righteousness. It's part of his name. In fact, he's called the king of Salem, but then he's also called Melchizedek, and Melchizedek means king of righteousness, the name itself. So righteousness is part of the name, and righteousness is more associated with priests than with kings, sadly. He supplies a provision of bread and wine. So it is something that is a messianic expectation that the Messiah would provide for the people. He's associated with God defeating enemies. And Melchizedek wasn't part of the battle, but he blesses God who delivered the enemies into Abram's hands. So the idea of deliverance from enemies and victory over enemies is part of the Melchizedek profile because it happened in that context. And it's mentioned in the blessing of Melchizedek to Abram. And he is superior to the Israelite kings and priests, both of them. Why? Because Abram honors Melchizedek with the tithe, and the lesser honors the greater. So if Abram honors Melchizedek, there is an implied superiority of Melchizedek. And the children are inferior to the father in their minds. So the sons of Abraham, including those Levitical priests and Davidic kings, would be under Melchizedek because he was over Abram sort of by a transference of the descendants being lesser than their ancestor. So all of these are messianic qualities, but one that gets added in the Psalms, Psalm 110, the only other place in the Old Testament where Melchizedek is mentioned. That's interesting, but he gets a mention in the paragraph we just read from Genesis, and this one passing reference in Psalm 110, and that's all there is from the Old Testament. And yet by the time of Jesus, there was a lot of talk about Melchizedek. And I'm going to show you some of that background before we're done. But I put the whole Psalm 110 up here because even though Melchizedek just gets one phrase in the middle, the context is so important. It's also a fairly short psalm, so we have time to read it. And it is a psalm of David. Not every psalm is associated with David. This one is. So just the fact that Melchizedek is mentioned in a psalm of David connects Melchizedek to that Davidic kingship. And so the Melchizedek messianic expectation becomes a part of the Davidic messianic expectations that the descendant of David would be the Messiah. But the psalm says, "A declaration of Yahweh to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Yahweh will send out your mighty scepter from Zion. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will volunteer in the day of your power. In holy splendor from the womb of the dawn, you will have the dew of your youth. Yahweh has sworn, and he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the manner of Melchizedek. O Lord, at your right hand he will shatter kings in the day of his anger. He will judge among the nations. He will fill them with corpses. He will shatter the rulers of many countries. He will drink from the stream by the road. Therefore he will lift up his head." There's a lot of imagery there that we don't have time to unpack. But this psalm is a psalm to a king, a Davidic king. And he says that this Davidic king is also going to be a priest forever. And that's why he mentions Melchizedek, after the order of Melchizedek. Just like Melchizedek was a king and a priest, so this Davidic heir is going to be a king and a priest. And this psalm was discussed by Jesus and some of the Pharisees in the New Testament. And Jesus makes the point that David can't be talking about himself. He must be talking about a descendant. But if it's a descendant, why would he call him Lord? Because as we just talked with Abraham, the descendants are supposed to be less than their ancestor. So David would be the greater. Why would he call his descendant Lord? That's the puzzle that Jesus puts before the Pharisees, in which they don't have an answer to. Of course, we do. Jesus was the answer to the puzzle, because he is both a descendant of David and God incarnate. And so his role in that way makes him David's Lord. It includes the idea of the Messiah being a victor over his enemies and being part of that, because that's also part of the psalm. It includes him being a priest and a king. But one bullet point at the end is that it associates Melchizedek with eternal life. And this heir of David, actually, at the same time. Because he says, you are a priest for how long? Forever. So that's what Psalm 110 sort of adds to the mix. It reaffirms all the things we just saw about Melchizedek. But then it says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So eternal life is also implied by this blessing that comes from Psalm 110. Now, before we turn to some of the outside the Bible material about Melchizedek, I want to point out that even though we saw the verse in Genesis 14 explicitly call him King of Salem and a priest of God Most High, just his name by itself, Melchizedek, would connote the ideas of priest and king together. And let me unpack that a little bit. The first part is simply translation, because Melech means king. Melchizedek starts with the word king. So king, and the Hebrew writer, when the Hebrew writer gets around to talking about this, he points this out. It's king of righteousness, because Melech means king. So Zedek means righteousness. And so Melchizedek is the combination of Melech and Zedek, king of righteousness. But there was a particular priest whose name was also righteousness. His name was Zadok. And Zadok was a priest who is introduced in the days of David. I just picked out a couple of places where Zadok is mentioned because he's very important, also figure from first century writings about the Messiah. But in 2 Samuel 15:24, we read David addressing and giving instructions about his son Solomon. He says, "Let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him," that is to anoint Solomon, "there as king over Israel. Blow on the trumpet and say, 'Long live King Solomon.'" So this isn't the first time Zadok is mentioned, but it's only the second. This is very early in his introduction. But he is appointed by David to go and anoint Solomon as king. So a very important, influential priest in David's realm. And Ezekiel then refers to Zadok and some of the descendants of Zadok. In Ezekiel 48:11, he says, "To the priests, to the ones being consecrated from the descendants of Zadok, who took care of my service and who did not go astray when the Israelites went astray, just as the Levites went astray." Zadok is praised, and the descendants of Zadok, for staying faithful to Yahweh when everyone else was going away, including the Levitical priests. Like Melchizedek, Zadok is sort of set apart from the rest of the priests, and even the Levitical priests. And if you look in the story of David and how Zadok plays into that back in 2 Samuel, it's sort of the same thing. Zadok was faithful to David even when Absalom took over the kingdom. And one of the priests, I think Abiathar, who was technically the high priest at the time, went with Absalom. Which priest went with David? Zadok. Zadok was faithful to the Lord's anointed, even when the high priest, and somebody who had been friendly with David to that point, but he went with Absalom. And Zadok went with David. To refer to Zadok is not just to refer to any old priest, but a priest who is definitely devoted to Yahweh, even in the midst of opposition. And so Melchizedek's name becomes affiliated with Zadok, this priest, and through the name righteousness, through that part of his name. So even just saying Melchizedek becomes just this highly charged name. It talks about the figure from chapter 14 of Genesis, yes, but it means more than that. It's also talking about that messianic expectation of king and priest together in one person who can bring it all together. And that's why it becomes a very important figure in the Dead Sea Scrolls and these other writings. Now here's where I'm going to give a little bit of background from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Two different sets of scrolls that I'm going to refer to. This first one is 4Q 544 through 4Q 548. Now what does that mean? It means that the scroll was found in the fourth cave near the Qumran community. So that's what the 4Q means. It was found in the fourth cave, because they had to number them so they could keep track. So this was cave number 4. And then it's a group of some associated fragments that were numbered 544, 545, 546, and so on. They just numbered the fragments and the scrolls that they found in there. So those are the numbers of the fragments from this fourth cave. Now this one actually has a nickname. They don't all have nicknames, but this one is called 4Q Visions of Amram, because that's what is in these fragments. They are clearly referring to Amram, who was the father of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. He's associated with Moses that way. And these are supposedly the narratives of a vision that God gave Amram, which we can tell by looking at the text. Now, these scrolls are all fragmentary, but it looks like the same vision of Amram was recorded more than once. They had multiple copies of this same piece. Not unusual for an important part to have multiple copies of it. And so the visions of Amram fragments are also subclassed as visions of Amram A, visions of Amram B, visions of Amram C, because there are multiple copies. So that's also part of it. So in the visions of Amram B, in a fragment, it's called fragment 2, we read and this is very fragmentary, because we can't even put a whole sentence together, really. But it's interesting. Here's what it says. I rule over you. Something. This watcher, who is he? And he said to me, this one is called something, and along with him is Melchizedek. And I said, my Lord, what is the ruling something? And then we hear dark, and all his work is dark, and in darkness he does something. And then we read, and he rules over all the darkness, and I, something. And then we read, from the upper to the lower regions, I rule over all that is bright and all something. That's all we get. But in the middle of it is this term, Melchizedek. Very, very interesting. Because that name means king of wickedness. It is the antonym to Melchizedek, king of righteousness. And clearly Melchizedek is evil and associated with darkness and all of that. It's just clear. So what this fragment lets us know is that Melchizedek and Melchizedek had become kind of opponents to one another. And the whole idea, their names became symbolic of the forces of good, king of righteousness, and the forces of evil, the king of wickedness, and how they were opposed to one another. Now, I don't think there was a physical man named Melchizedek, but I do think there was a Melchizedek, but I think his name became a form, just a word that became resonant for all these evil forces or good forces that opposed the evil forces. Here's my take on interpreting the name Melchizedek based on what we read, and something I'm giving this a little ahead of the slide about the other Dead Sea Scrolls. And really, it's probably worth less than 2 cents. I am not a scholar. I'm not a biblical scholar. I have read that much of the background material, but here's my 2 cents. I think Melchizedek was formed in imitation of Melchizedek with the opposite meaning. I just explained that. I think that Melchizedek and Melchizedek were used to designate these opposing supernatural powers at war in the unseen realm without necessarily meaning to reference the original historical man. I just think they became bywords. So Melchizedek becomes to designate the messianic figure who would embody the qualities of the biblical Genesis 14 Melchizedek. But that doesn't mean that the messianic figure is the Melchizedek from Genesis 14. I just think that the man named Melchizedek from Genesis 14 inspired the ideas that became termed Melchizedek in the writings. We can kind of see that with the way Jesus talks about Elijah in Mark 9:11 through 13. Because it's when, in that passage, Jesus is asked by his disciples, why does the scripture say that Elijah has to come first and then the Messiah? And Jesus says, Elijah did come first. But the world treated him the way the world treats prophets. And so what does Jesus mean? Does that mean... He obviously seems to be talking about John the Baptist. So was John the Baptist literally Elijah resurrected or reincarnated? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that the name Elijah became associated with certain things that were going to happen, and John the Baptist fulfilled those things in his ministry. And so he is, quote-unquote, Elijah, because he's fulfilling those things. And I think that that's how Melchizedek is being used in these writings. It's our hope, our anticipation of the person who's going to fulfill what Melchizedek stands for in the Scriptures. And we see that clearly in a Dead Sea Scroll that's called 11Q13. Again, in the 11th cave from the Qumran community and the 13th scroll that they found there. Unfortunately, with this particular scroll, all of column number 1 is lost. Column number 2 we have pretty much intact, and column number 3 is again fragmentary. But column number 2 refers to Melchizedek a couple of times, clearly about him mainly. So this whole scroll is nicknamed 11Q Melchizedek. So you might hear about that if you're reading about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's one of the most important ones out there because it sheds light on this figure of Melchizedek. Here is a taste of what the whole scroll says. I'm just going to quote a few lines. It is the time for the year of grace of Melchizedek and of his armies, the nation of the holy ones of God, of the rule of judgment, as it is written about him in the songs of David, who said, Elohim will stand in the assembly of God, in the midst of the gods he judges. That's from Psalm 82, verse 1. And about him he said, and above it to the heights return, God will judge the peoples. That's from Psalm 7, 8 and 9. For what he said, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Salah. That's the next verse from Psalm 82, verse 2. Its interpretation concerns Belial and the spirits of his lot who, turning aside from the commandments of God to commit evil. What is he basically saying? He's basically saying that this Melchizedek figure is going to fulfill the promise of Psalm 82, which is to judge and condemn and ultimately destroy these evil spirits that have been rebelling against God's rule, as described in Psalm 82. And the next line says, but Melchizedek will carry out the vengeance of God's judgment, and on that day he will free them from the hand of Belial and from the hand of all the spirits of his lot. Belial is a term for the devil, for the leader of the evil spirits. It's used one time in the New Testament in the form of Beliar, ends with an R, but it's the same name. But it's basically Satan or the devil, and this Melchizedek is going to free from the hand of the devil. This is just one part. In this brief passage from 11Q Melchizedek, there are at least 5 different messianic expectations articulated. He is going to initiate a year of Jubilee. The passage specifically quotes from Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15. He is going to provide a day of atonement that is permanent. He quotes Leviticus 25:9, which is about the Day of Atonement. He's going to free those who are oppressed by the hand of Belial, which we just read, which he quotes Psalm 82. He's going to declare the message of salvation in Zion, which he quotes Isaiah 52, verse 7, which is about blessed are the feet of him who brings good news. And he's going to reign as the anointed prince, and he quotes Daniel 9, talking about how an evil king is going to break off worship in the temple, but there will be an anointed priest who comes to restore it. The thing about it is, all of these expectations are fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus does indeed initiate a year of Jubilee. In Luke chapter 4, he quotes from Isaiah saying, this is the day of the Lord's favor. This is the year of the Lord's favor. It's the year of Jubilee. He does provide a permanent day of atonement. Hebrews 9 talks about Jesus' sacrifice in Day of Atonement terms. He did free those oppressed by the hand of Belial. Acts 10 talks about Jesus freeing from the evil spirits of the devil. He did declare the message of salvation in Zion, and he is reigning as the anointed prince. So Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these things. Hebrews chapters 5 through 7 is the unpacking of all this background in the Christian walk. So I'm going to let the Hebrew writer make the application. I think he does it. And if we have this background in mind, then just reading those chapters, things are going to jump off the page at you. Thank you for joining me today as we look at the figure of Melchizedek and the connections to Messiah. I would encourage you on your own to read through Hebrews chapters 5 through 7 and consider how the background information we discussed today informs what he's writing about how Jesus and Melchizedek are connected. If you see something new in the chapters based on what you learned today, please feel free to share your insight in a comment on the YouTube channel or come over to the Facebook discussion group and comment there. I look forward to the next time we get together to examine the treasures in the biblical text as we look for glimpses of the supernatural in the figures of Genesis.